I'm 84 years old now. My hands shake when I hold a coffee cup, but there are some memories that never tremble. For 40 years, my family carried a secret that shaped every choice we made out there in those woods. We didn't hide it for fame. We didn't hide it for money. We hid it because something trusted us. And when the FBI came knocking, unannounced, with guns and questions, we learned too late what trust costs when it's misplaced. I've stayed quiet long enough. And before I'm gone, I need you to know why Bigfoot felt like family. My name is Samuel H. Carter. In the autumn of 1977, I was 36 years old, working as a licensed wilderness contractor in the northern Cascade foothills of Washington State. The Forest Service paid me decent money to winterize unused fire lookout cabins and maintain footbridges before the first heavy snow. It was October 14th, a Thursday, and I was splitting kindling behind our lower cabin while my wife Helen prepared venison stew inside. The sound came just after 3 in the afternoon. 3 hollow knocks against wood, deliberate, spaced maybe 4 seconds apart. Not the random percussion of a woodpecker or the crack of a falling branch, but something measured, almost rhythmic. I stopped mid-swing, the maul frozen above my head, and listened. The forest had gone quiet. Not silent, you understand. There's a difference. The Douglas firs still whispered in the breeze, water still moved in the creek below, but the smaller sounds, the birds and squirrels, they'd all stopped at once. That's when you pay attention in the woods. That's when something bigger than you is moving through. I heard footfalls then, heavy, deliberate, circling wide through the timber uphill from our clearing. Too slow to be a deer, too heavy to be anything I wanted to meet unprepared. I set down the maul and picked up my Winchester 94, not raising it, just holding it across my chest, the way you do when you're curious but cautious. My son David, 6 years old, was throwing pine cones down the slope toward the creek. "Dad," he called, "what's that smell?" He was right. The wind had shifted, carrying something I'd never encountered in 20 years of backcountry work. Organic, dense, almost overwhelming. Like rain on old fir mixed with wet rot and something metallic, iron-rich. Not the clean musk of elk or the sharp ammonia of cougar. This was deeper, older somehow. I told David to go inside. He must have heard something in my voice because he didn't argue, just dropped his pine cones and ran. The shape moved between 2 western red cedars about 60 yards uphill, just for a moment, tall enough that I saw it clearly against the gray October sky. Not crossing, not fleeing, observing. I'd been taught by my grandfather that curiosity beats panic in the woods. Panic gets you hurt. Curiosity keeps you alive. So I followed. The ground was soft from 3 days of rain. Near the creek, I found impressions in the damp loam that made me stop. Breathing. Longer than my forearm, wider than my hand, spread flat. 5 distinct toe marks, the big toe offset like a thumb. The ball of the foot sunk deep, maybe 1.5 inches, suggesting weight I couldn't begin to calculate. I'd seen bear tracks my whole life. These weren't bear tracks. I crossed the creek, rifle still across my chest, and pushed through a stand of sword ferns on the far bank. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It was crouched maybe 30 feet away, partially obscured by the ferns, but not really hiding. 1 knee down, 1 massive hand braced against the earth. Dark fur, charcoal black with rust-brown highlights catching the filtered light along its spine. Broad shoulders that would have made a grizzly look narrow. Arms that hung past where its knees would be if it stood. And it was looking directly at me. I want to be precise about this because it matters. The eyes weren't wild. They weren't the flat, predatory stare of a cougar or the panicked whites of a startled elk. They were guarded, cautious, but behind that caution was something I hadn't expected to see in anything that looked like that. Consideration. It was thinking, evaluating, deciding. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The Winchester suddenly felt stupid in my hands, inadequate, like bringing a fly swatter to face a locomotive. Then it did something that changed everything. It lifted one hand, slowly, deliberately, palm open, fingers spread wide, not threatening, not reaching, just showing me. Then it lowered that hand back to the ground, still watching my face. I understood two things in that moment. First, this thing, whatever it was showing me it meant no harm. Second, if I reported what I was seeing, if I told anyone with authority or resources or ambition, this creature wouldn't be studied. It would be hunted, captured, killed, dissected, turned into proof of something science said couldn't exist, and I couldn't let that happen. I don't know how to explain what I felt except to say that I recognized something in those eyes. Not human, but not animal either. Something in between. Something that deserved better than a bullet or a cage. I lowered my rifle, slung it over my shoulder. Then I did the same thing it had done. Raised my hand, palm open, and lowered it slowly to the ground. The creature's eyes widened just slightly. If I hadn't been watching so closely, I might have missed it. Then it stood, rising to its full height in one fluid motion, and I had to tilt my head back to keep my eyes on its face. 8.5 feet, easy, maybe more. Barrel-chested, with a distinctive pale scar running diagonally across its left shoulder, old and healed into a silver line through the dark fur. It took one step backward, then another, never turning its back on me. Then it was gone, moving through the undergrowth with surprising silence for something that size. I stood there in the sword ferns for a long time after it disappeared. My legs were shaking, my hands were shaking. Everything was shaking except the memory of what I'd just seen and the certainty of what I had to do next. I walked back across the creek and spent 20 minutes erasing my own tracks, scattering leaves, breaking up the clear impressions in the mud. By the time I was done, it looked like nothing more than natural disturbance. Maybe a small bear, maybe nothing. That night, after David was asleep and my grandparents had retired to the upper cabin, I told Helen what I'd seen. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always loved about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "If you'd shot it," she finally said, "you'd be on the news by tomorrow." "I know." "And if you'd run away and told everyone?" "Same result," she nodded slowly. "So we keep it to ourselves." "We keep it to ourselves." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Sam, what if it comes back?" "Then we give it space," I said, "and we keep it safe." That was the moment I became a protector instead of just a witness. You have to understand why I made the choice I did. It wasn't just about that one moment in the ferns, though God knows that was enough to knock the ground out from under everything I thought I knew about the world. It was about how I was raised, about what this land meant to my family. My grandparents, William and Dorothy Carter, had purchased 2 pre-Depression cabins in 1932 for $800. Back then, this was just timberland, remote and worthless to anyone who didn't love silence. They'd fled the city, fled the Depression's breadlines, and built a life out here where the only currency that mattered was how well you could read weather and how much wood you could split before winter. By 1977, the federal government had designated most of the surrounding area as protected land, part of a wilderness corridor meant to preserve old-growth forest. Our 2 cabins sat grandfathered in, legal but isolated, accessible only by an old logging road we kept deliberately rough and gated with a camouflaged chain. The nearest neighbor was 11 miles away by dirt road. My grandparents had spent 45 years protecting this land from developers who saw board feet and profit margins, from poachers who shot elk out of season and left the carcasses to rot, from anyone who wanted to take more than they gave back. When they passed the property to me in 1975, my grandfather pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. This land doesn't belong to us, Samuel. We just get to keep it safe for a while." I'd grown up watching him chase off surveyors with a shotgun and diplomacy in equal measure. I'd learned patience from him, the kind that lets you sit still for hours, waiting for the forest to forget you're there. And I'd learned that some things matter more than what's convenient, or profitable, or easy to explain. So when I saw that creature in the ferns, when I looked into those eyes and recognized something that deserved protection, I was just doing what I'd been taught my whole life. Patience, protection, silence. The next morning, October 15th, I went back to the creek alone. The rain had returned overnight, but in the mud beneath an overhanging cedar, I found the prints again. Deeper this time, more defined. I took measurements with a carpenter's tape, 18 inches long, 7 inches across at the widest point. I wrote the numbers in my work journal, but didn't photograph them. Then I backfilled the prints with creek gravel and pine duff until they disappeared. Over the next 2 weeks, I established a new routine. Every evening after finishing my Forest Service work, I'd walk the property boundaries, checking for signs. Sometimes I found them, a partial print here, a broken branch at head height there, once a smooth patch in the mud where something large had sat for a while. I never saw the creature again during those first weeks, but I knew it was watching. You develop a sense for that in the backcountry. The feeling of eyes on you, the small wrongness in the pattern of bird calls, the way deer avoid a certain corridor. Helen started leaving food scraps at the tree line. Nothing deliberate, nothing that would look like feeding. Just the remains of a venison roast wrapped in paper, the kind of thing we'd normally bury or burn. We'd leave it by the woodpile after dark, and by morning it would be gone. No torn paper, no scattered bones. Just gone. David asked about the smell one more time. I told him it was probably a bear passing through. He accepted that the way 6-year-olds accept most things their parents say, with absolute faith that slightly breaks your heart. My grandparents knew something was happening. William watched me check the tree line too often, saw me startle at distant sounds. But he didn't ask, and I didn't volunteer. That was our way. November brought the first snow, early and heavy. I was up at the North Fire Lookout on November 19th, winterizing the windows with plastic sheeting, when I heard it for the first time. A vocalization, deep, resonant, somewhere between a howl and a moan. Not quite the sound of any animal I knew, but close enough to several that you might convince yourself it was just a strange coyote or a bull elk in rut. But I knew better. I answered it, cupped my hands around my mouth, and made a low, sustained call. Not mimicking what I'd heard, just acknowledging it. Letting it know I'd heard. Letting it know I was listening. The sound came again, closer this time, and I saw movement in the tree line 200 yards out. A dark shape, upright, there and gone in the space between snowflakes. That was the beginning. Winter of 1977 turned into the coldest season we'd had in 8 years. By December 3rd, we had 4 feet of snow packed around both cabins, and the temperature hadn't climbed above 20 degrees in 10 days. I spent most of my time maintaining the access road with a borrowed plow blade on my '74 Ford F-250, keeping a single lane open in case of emergency. The visits became regular that winter, not daily but patterned. Every 4 or 5 days, usually just after dusk, I'd hear 3 knocks against the old lightning-struck cedar at the north edge of our clearing. The tree was hollow, struck years before I was born, just a shell of bark and memory, standing about 40 feet tall. On December 9th, I walked out to check on the sound and found the creature, what I'd started thinking of as him, though I had no real evidence of gender, sheltering inside the hollow trunk. He'd scraped out the old rotwood, creating a space just big enough for his massive frame. His breath misted in the freezing air, and even in the dim light of my kerosene lantern, I could see he was shivering. I didn't approach, just stood at a respectful distance and said, "It's your tree, friend. Stay warm." He watched me walk back to the cabin. The next morning, the hollow cedar had been carefully packed with fresh pine boughs, insulation against the wind. I saw him use that shelter 3 more times that winter, and after the first time, I started leaving firewood stacked nearby. Not to encourage him, just to offer what I could. We started calling him Holloway, named after that cedar, after the shelter he'd claimed. Helen suggested it one night in January 1978, and it stuck. It felt important to name him, made him more than just a thing, made him someone. The first time David saw Holloway clearly was July 2nd, 1979. He was 8 years old by then, tall for his age and curious about everything. He'd been playing at the creek when he came running back, not scared, but excited. "Dad, there's a bear by the water, a really big one." I knew immediately it wasn't a bear. I walked down with him, and sure enough, Holloway was crouched by the creek's edge, drinking. He looked up when he heard us, water dripping from his chin. David froze, and I put my hand on his shoulder. "That's not a bear, is it?" David whispered. "No, son, it's not." "What is it?" I thought about how to answer that, about what truth meant when you were 8 years old and everything still made sense in simple categories. "It's a friend," I finally said. "Someone who lives here, same as us, and we keep him safe by not telling anyone about him." David stared at Holloway. Holloway stared back. Then my son did something I'll never forget. He waved, just a small wave, barely moving his hand. And Holloway lifted one massive hand and slowly, awkwardly, waved back. David started leaving apples out after that. Helen had planted a small orchard in 1976, and by 1979 we were getting decent yields. David would pick the best ones, the ones without wormholes or bruises, and place them on a flat rock near the tree line. By morning, they'd be gone, and sometimes there'd be something left in return, a smooth river stone, a piece of bark with scratches that might have been deliberate. Once, a perfect circle of braided grass. That's when I truly understood that Holloway wasn't just intelligent. He had culture, he understood reciprocity, gift for gift, trust for trust. By the summer of 1980, we'd developed a basic communication system. Holloway learned our routines. He knew when I left for Forest Service work at dawn. He knew when Helen hung laundry on Wednesdays. He knew when David played at the creek in the afternoons. And he adjusted his visits to avoid overlap with anything unexpected. Once, a Forest Service supervisor made a surprise visit to check on my work. I'd heard the truck coming from a mile away and had just enough time to scan the tree line. Holloway was there, barely visible in the shadows. I made a quick circling gesture with my hand, the signal we'd developed for danger. He vanished like smoke. The supervisor never knew how close he'd come to the discovery of the century. We learned his signals too. 2 knocks meant leave. Open palm meant safe. A low huffing sound meant he was curious about something. And when he made a deep, resonant hum, almost subvocal, it meant he was content. I heard that hum more often as the years went on. Fall of 1983 brought our first real scare. Poachers set up camp about 2 miles south of our property in late September. We heard their generator running at night, heard distant gunfire during the day. Holloway disappeared for 3 weeks. No visits, no signs, no sounds. I thought he was dead. Helen and I didn't talk about it much, but I could see it in her face. The way she'd glance at the tree line with that tight-lipped expression that meant she was holding back tears. David stopped leaving apples out. The flat rock sat empty. On October 18th, just after midnight, I heard the 3 knocks again. I practically ran outside in my long underwear, and there he was, alive but hurt. His right leg was injured, not bleeding but swollen, and he was keeping his weight off it. Across his ribs were 3 parallel scratches, fresh enough that they still looked raw in the moonlight. Cougar marks. He must have run into a big male protecting territory. I wanted to help, but I knew better than to approach. Instead, I brought out my first aid kit, set it on the ground between us, and backed away. He watched me, then limped forward and picked it up. His fingers were so large that the metal box looked like a child's toy in his hands. He opened it clumsily, examined the contents, then selected a roll of gauze and a small bottle of Bactine antiseptic. The way he held them, turning them over, studying them, told me he understood their purpose, even if he'd never seen them before. He poured antiseptic on the scratches, his whole body tensing but not making a sound. Then he tried to wrap the gauze around his ribs, struggling with the mechanics of it. "Hold on," I said. "Let me show you." I pantomimed the motion, wrapping an imaginary bandage around my own ribs. He watched, then tried again. This time, he got it. The gauze wouldn't stay perfectly in place with all that fur, but it was something. When he was done, he set the first aid kit back down, looked at me for a long moment, then limped back toward the tree line. At the edge of the clearing, he turned. Our eyes met across 50 feet of moonlit grass. Then he nodded once, deliberately, and disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, I found the first aid kit exactly where he'd left it, with every item carefully placed back inside except the gauze and antiseptic. The lid was closed. By 1985, my grandparents were both in their late 70s. They'd moved into the upper cabin full-time, and William's hands shook too much to split wood anymore. I took over most of the heavy work, and Holloway seemed to sense the change in our household dynamics. He started staying closer during that time. Some nights I'd see him at the edge of the clearing, just sitting, watching the lit windows of both cabins. It reminded me of how David used to sit on the porch and watch us through the window when he was too small to go to bed alone. That same kind of lonely watchfulness. On Christmas Eve 1985, Helen made extra stew. Not for Holloway specifically, just extra. She set a large pot of it, still warm, on the back porch in an old enamel pan we never used anymore. By morning, it was gone. 2 days later, I found that same enamel pan sitting on a stump near the creek. It had been washed, scrubbed clean in the creek water, every trace of stew removed, and left where I'd find it. That was the moment I knew beyond any doubt that we weren't protecting an animal. We were protecting a person who just happened to look different. The late 80s brought more challenges. Ronald Reagan was president, and logging in the Cascades had intensified. New roads cut deeper into what had been roadless wilderness. I'd hear chainsaws echoing through the valleys, see fresh clear-cuts appearing on distant ridges. Holloway's usual routes were being disrupted. More than once, I saw him return to our clearing from unexpected directions, taking longer paths through denser cover. Once, in the summer of 1987, he didn't show up for almost 6 weeks. When he finally returned, he was thinner, warier, and he flinched at the sound of our truck starting. Something had scared him badly out there. By 1989, we'd refined our communication to the point where it felt almost like a language. Not words, but understanding. He'd crouch at the tree line, and I'd walk out to meet him. He'd make a gesture, a low vocalization, and I'd know what he needed. Sometimes it was just presence, just the acknowledgement that he wasn't alone. Sometimes it was a warning. Once, he led me to a section of our fence that had been damaged, probably by elk, that I hadn't noticed yet. He was looking out for us the same way we looked out for him. Winter of 1989 was hard on William. His breathing had gotten worse, and by February, he was spending most of his time indoors. On February 23rd, he passed away in his sleep, Dorothy beside him. He was 81 years old. We buried him 3 days later in a small plot we designated years before at the top of the rise between the two cabins. The funeral was small, just family, just us. That night, Holloway stood vigil at the edge of the clearing. I don't know how he knew. Maybe he'd seen the commotion, the unfamiliar car from the funeral home, the grave freshly dug. Maybe he'd sensed something in the air, the way animals sense weather. But he stood there, just at the boundary of shadow and moonlight, for 3 nights in a row. not moving, not approaching, just present. On the third night, I walked out to where he stood, didn't say anything, just stood beside him, both of us looking toward the gravesite. After a while, he made that deep subvocal hum, not contentment this time, something else, something that sounded like understanding, like shared grief. He reached out slowly and touched my shoulder with one enormous hand, the gentlest pressure, there and gone. Then he walked away into the darkness, and I stood there and cried for the first time since my grandfather died. The 90s brought technology that made secrecy harder. In 1992, I started seeing helicopters more often, Forest Service aerial surveys mapping timber. I'd watch them pass overhead and wonder what they'd see if they were looking at the right moment. Holloway learned to recognize the sound, to freeze or take cover when he heard rotor blades. Cell towers started going up in the valleys. Not in our area, we were still too remote, but close enough that I knew it was coming. I bought my first answering machine in 1994, and it felt like an invasion, like the outside world was finding new ways to reach in. Dorothy passed in 1996, just 3 weeks after her 88th birthday. Pneumonia took her fast. One day she was shelling peas on the porch. 4 days later, she was gone. We buried her next to William, and Holloway stood vigil again. David was 24 by then, working construction in Spokane. He'd come home for the funeral and stayed a few extra days. On his last evening, we sat on the porch and watched the tree line as the sun set. "Does he still come around?" David asked. "Not as often, but yes." "I've kept the secret," he said. "Never told anyone. Not girlfriends, not drinking buddies, not anybody." "I know. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it, if we all imagined it together, like some kind of family delusion." I shook my head. "You didn't imagine it." "How do you know?" "Because he's standing right there," I said, nodding toward the tree line. David looked. At first I thought he'd missed him, but then David raised his hand in that same small wave he'd given as an 8-year-old. And from the shadows, barely visible in the failing light, Holloway raised his hand in return. "Jesus," David whispered. "He's really there. He's really there. You ever wonder what his life is like? Like, is he the last one? Is he lonely?" I'd wondered that myself 1,000 times. "I think he's lonely," I said. "I think that's why he keeps coming back." The new millennium brought changes I didn't like. After September 11, 2001, I started seeing more federal vehicles on the forest roads. Increased patrols, they said. Heightened security for infrastructure. I didn't like the way rangers asked more questions, took more notes, seemed more interested in who was coming and going from private property. Holloway must have sensed it too. His visits became shorter, more cautious. Where he used to linger for hours, sometimes half the night, now he'd appear, check the clearing, take whatever food we'd left, and vanish within minutes. In the spring of 2004, I saw my first drone, a small one, hobbyist size, flying low over the valley. It didn't come near our property, but I watched it with a knot in my stomach, knowing what it represented. Eyes in the sky. Cameras that could see through forest canopy. The technology I'd feared was finally here. I started being more careful, stopped leaving food in predictable places, varied the times and locations, taught Helen to check for aircraft before stepping outside. It felt paranoid, but paranoia kept secrets safe. By 2010, I was 69 years old, and the work was getting harder. I'd retired from Forest Service contracts 5 years earlier, and the cabins felt bigger, quieter, emptier with just Helen and me. David had married, moved to Seattle, started a family. He visited twice a year, and his kids loved the woods, but they never saw what he'd seen. We'd made sure of that. Holloway was aging too. I could see it in the way he moved, slower now, more deliberate. The silver scar on his shoulder had spread, more white in his fur, particularly around his face. We were both getting old, both running out of time. I thought about what would happen when Helen and I were gone. Who would protect him then? Who would keep the secret? There was no good answer. Summer of 2011 brought fire, not close, 20 miles south, but close enough that we spent 3 weeks on evacuation standby. Smoke filled the valleys, turned the sun red, made breathing difficult. Holloway disappeared during that time, and I didn't blame him. Animals know to run from fire. When he came back in September, he looked different. Thinner, more nervous, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting threats from every direction. The world was getting more dangerous, and he knew it. Helen got sick in 2013. Cancer. It started in her lungs and spread fast despite treatment. By the spring of 2014, she was bedridden, and I became a full-time caregiver. Holloway stopped coming during that time, and part of me was grateful. I couldn't have maintained our routine, couldn't have kept watch. She passed on June 8, 2014, 73 years old. We'd been married for 48 years. I buried her next to my grandparents, and that night I sat on the porch with a bottle of Williams Old Whiskey and waited. I thought maybe Holloway would come, thought maybe he'd stand vigil one more time. He didn't show. I drank until the stars blurred, and I cried until there was nothing left. He came 3 weeks later, in the middle of the night. I heard the knocks and stumbled outside, still half drunk on grief. He stood at the tree line, and even in the darkness, I could see the hesitation in his posture. I walked out to meet him, stood 10 feet away, close enough to see his eyes in the moonlight. "She's gone," I said, voice cracking. "Everyone's gone. It's just me now." He took 1 step closer, then another. Then he closed the distance between us and wrapped his arms around me in something that could only be called a hug. It was awkward, his body too large, his arms too long, but it was deliberate, intentional. Comfort offered by someone who understood loss. I stood there in the embrace of a Bigfoot and cried like a child. He held me for maybe 30 seconds. Then he stepped back, looked at me with those eyes that had seen too much, and made that deep hum one more time. Then he walked away, and I didn't see him again for almost a year. The world kept changing. In 2015, someone launched a drone over my property. I heard it, saw it hovering above the north tree line for maybe 5 minutes before it flew away. I reported it to the sheriff as a privacy violation, but they didn't take it seriously. I started sleeping with my rifle beside the bed. In 2016, I noticed fresh survey stakes on the boundary of my property. When I called the county about it, they said a development company was exploring options for a resort, way up at the north end of the valley. Too far to affect me directly, they said, but it meant roads, traffic, tourists. It meant the isolation I'd relied on for 40 years was ending. Holloway's visits became rare. Sometimes 3 months would pass with no sign. I left food anyway, just in case, but more often than not, it would rot before anything took it. I think he was preparing to leave permanently. I think he knew what I knew. Our time was running out. In early 2017, a ranger I didn't recognize showed up at my door. Said there had been reports of unusual prints in the area, asked if I'd seen anything strange. I played dumb, said I'd seen plenty of bear and elk, must be what folks were seeing. He didn't seem convinced, but he left. 2 months later, another ranger. Different one. Same questions. This time with a camera, asking if he could take photos around my property. I refused, told him he needed a warrant for that. He left too, but I knew something had changed. Someone was paying attention. In August 2017, I found a trail camera strapped to a tree just inside my property line. Not mine, no identification on it. I smashed it with a rock and threw the pieces in the creek. 3 more appeared over the next month. I stopped leaving food out, stopped doing anything that might draw attention, started sleeping in my truck some nights, parked where I could watch the access road. Something was coming. I could feel it. They came on October 4th, 2018. Early morning, just after sunrise. 3 black SUVs, government plates, moving fast up my access road. I'd heard them coming from a mile away and was already on the porch with my Winchester when they pulled into my clearing. FBI. 8 of them. Body armor, sidearms, that particular combination of authority and aggression that comes from federal agencies who think they're above local law. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with severe gray eyes, flashed her badge like it was a magic talisman that could override 40 years of my life. Samuel Carter, we need to ask you some questions. You're on private property, I said, and unless you've got a warrant, you can leave the same way you came. She smiled, but it didn't reach those gray eyes. We have credible reports of an undocumented biological entity in this area. Large primate, possibly dangerous. We have reason to believe you've had contact. My heart was hammering, but I kept my face neutral. You mean a bear? Yeah, I've seen plenty of bears. Not a bear, Mr. Carter, and I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. One of the other agents had moved to the tree line, scanning the woods with what looked like thermal imaging equipment. Another was photographing the clearing, the cabins, everything. Who told you? I asked. The lead agent's expression didn't change. That's classified, but we have evidence, photographs, tissue samples, and testimony from a witness who says you've been harboring this creature for decades. Tissue samples. Someone had found something Holloway left behind. Hair, maybe? Something with DNA that didn't match anything in their databases. And a witness. Someone had talked. I don't know what you're talking about, I said. Mr. Carter, we can do this the easy way, or we can come back with that warrant and tear your property apart. If this creature is here, we will find it. And if you've been protecting it, you're looking at federal charges. Obstruction, possibly more. I thought about Holloway, about whether he was close enough to hear this, about whether he'd understand what was happening. There's nothing here, I said. Never has been. You're wasting your time. The agent studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded to her team. Search the perimeter and set up cameras. If something's here, we'll get it on film. They spent 4 hours combing through my property. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. I'd spent 40 years making sure of that. When they finally left, the lead agent handed me a card. If you change your mind, Mr. Carter, if you decide to cooperate, call that number. I watched them drive away. Then I burned the card in my wood stove. That night, I heard the 3 knocks. For the first time in months, Holloway had come. I walked out to the tree line, and he was there, closer than he'd been in years. Close enough that I could see the concern in his eyes. He'd heard, he'd watched, he understood. They know, I said. I don't know how, but they know, and they're not going to stop. He made a low sound, questioning. You have to leave, I said. Go deep, find somewhere they can't follow, because if they come back, if they find you... I couldn't finish the sentence. He stood there, and in the moonlight I could see he'd aged even more since I'd seen him last. More silver in his fur, more weight to his movements. He looked like what he was, an old creature at the end of his time, tired of running, tired of hiding. He reached out and touched my shoulder, that same gentle pressure from years before. Then he turned and walked into the forest. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore, standing there in the October night, and I knew I'd never see him again. They came back on November 2nd, same team, but this time with more equipment, more cameras, and this time they had papers. A warrant authorizing search and surveillance based on credible threat to public safety. They set up a perimeter around my property, motion sensors, cameras, tripwires, turned my home into a prison. We know it's been here, the lead agent said. We have fresh prints less than a week old. All we need is one clear photograph, one piece of evidence, and then we can move forward with capture protocols. Capture protocols, I repeated. You mean kill it. We prefer live capture, but if the subject is aggressive, we're authorized to use lethal force. It's not aggressive. It's never been aggressive. The agent smiled that same cold smile. So you admit you've had contact. I'd walked right into it. 40 years of careful silence, broken in one moment of anger. Get off my property, I said. We're here under legal authority, Mr. Carter. You can't make us leave. They stayed for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of constant surveillance, of agents tramping through my woods, of helicopters passing overhead. 3 weeks of knowing that every moment someone was watching, and Holloway never showed. I thought maybe he'd finally done what I'd told him to do, gone deep, found safety. I let myself hope. Then on November 21st at 4:47 in the morning, I heard gunshots, 3 shots, rapid fire, from the direction of the hollow cedar. I ran. I'm 77 years old. My knees are bad. My back is worse, but I ran faster than I'd moved in 20 years. Agents were yelling behind me to stop, to stay back, but I didn't care. I found them gathered around the cedar. 6 agents, weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. And in the beam of those lights, I saw blood. Fresh blood, dark against the pale wood of the hollow cedar. "Where is he?" I shouted. "What did you do?" The lead agent turned to me, and for the first time, her expression showed something other than cold. Authority. She looked shaken. "It attacked Agent Morrison. We had no choice." "Bullshit! He wouldn't attack anyone. Where is he?" "The subject fled north. We're organizing a tracking team." "He's wounded. You shot him, and now he's out there bleeding." "Mr. Carter, you need to return to your cabin. Now. This is an active operation." I ignored her, pushed past the agents and examined the blood. Too much of it. Too much for anyone to survive losing. The trail led north into heavy timber, drops and smears marking every few feet. I tried to follow, but 2 agents grabbed my arms, physically restraining me. "Let me go. I can find him. Please, just let me." They dragged me back to my cabin and posted a guard outside. Locked me in my own home while they hunted the only friend I'd had left in the world. I sat by the window and watched dawn break over the forest. Watched helicopters arrive. Watched teams of agents with tracking dogs spread out through the timber. They searched for 3 days. They never found a body. On the 4th day, they packed up, took down their cameras, their sensors, their whole operation. The lead agent knocked on my door one last time. "We know what we saw," she said. "We know what's been here, but without a body, without proof, this case is closed. For now." "So that's it? You shot him and just leave?" "We followed protocols, Mr. Carter. If you want to file a complaint, you're welcome to try." She left me with that. With protocols. With the knowledge that they'd killed something remarkable and would never face consequences because officially it never existed. I searched for him myself, every day for 2 months until the snow got too deep. Followed the blood trail as far as I could, checked every hollow, every cave, every shelter he might have used. I never found him. But I found something else. 6 months later, in May 2019, I found fresh braided grass on a stump near the north boundary, the same kind he used to leave, but woven differently, tighter, more complex. I don't know if he survived. I don't know if someone else made it. But I let myself hope. I'm 84 years old now, and I'm telling this story because Holloway deserves to be more than silence. He deserves to be more than a secret I carry to my grave. For 40 years, we protected something gentle, something that watched a small boy grow up, that stood vigil at graves, that returned a borrowed pan, scrubbed clean, in creek water, something that understood trust and reciprocity and grief. And when the outside world finally learned about him, they didn't come with wonder. They came with guns. I stayed quiet for 6 years after he disappeared, told myself that silence kept him safe, wherever he was. But I'm running out of time, and the truth is this: silence never protected anyone. It just made it easier for people to pretend their violence didn't happen. Someone talked, someone broke the secret, and I'll never know who. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe someone saw more than I realized and couldn't keep it to themselves. Maybe the trail cameras caught something before I smashed them. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that Holloway existed. He was real, and he deserved better than what we gave him. David comes to visit more often now. He's 50 years old, working as a structural engineer in Portland, teaching his own kids about the woods. Sometimes we sit on the porch and talk about those years, about the creature that changed everything. His kids think it's just a family story, like tall tales about the fish that got away. Maybe that's better. Maybe some things should stay as wonder rather than evidence. But I needed to tell this. Needed someone to know that when we talk about Bigfoot, about Sasquatch, about forest giants, we're not just talking about blurry photographs and footprints. We're talking about someone who felt loss, who showed compassion, who chose to trust despite every reason not to. We're talking about someone the government killed because they couldn't control him. I think about Holloway every day, about the way he'd stand at the tree line, patient and watchful, about his careful gestures, his deliberate communication, about the night he held me while I cried for my wife. I think about that last touch, his hand on my shoulder before he walked away. Like he knew, like he was saying goodbye. Sometimes, late at night, I hear 3 knocks. I know it's just the wind, just old wood settling, just the forest making the sounds forests make. But I go outside anyway, stand in the clearing and wait, hoping. He never appears. But that braided grass keeps showing up, every few months in different locations around the property, always fresh, always complex, and I choose to believe. This isn't a story about monsters. It's not even a story about cryptids or undiscovered species. It's a story about what happens when something doesn't fit our neat categories, when wonder meets bureaucracy, when gentle trust meets institutional violence. It's a story about how easily we destroy what we don't understand. And it's a story about how much I miss my friend. I don't expect anyone to believe this. I don't have photographs or physical evidence or anything that would satisfy skeptics. I have memories and a pile of braided grass and the knowledge that for 40 years I knew someone remarkable. That has to be enough. Before I go, before whatever time I have left runs out, I wanted someone to know. I wanted to say his name. Holloway, not Bigfoot, not Sasquatch, not some unnamed creature in the woods. Holloway. And he mattered. The hollow cedar is still standing. I visit it sometimes, sit with my back against the pale wood, and think about the winters he sheltered there, about the night I found him shivering, about the fresh pine boughs he'd gathered for warmth. The wood is still stained where he bled. They never cleaned it up, never even acknowledged what happened there. But I see it. I remember. And I'm telling you now so that someone else will remember too. That's all we get in the end. To be remembered, to have someone say our names and know we existed, that we mattered, that we were here. Holloway was here, and he trusted us, and we failed him. But for 40 years, for a brief moment in the long history of these woods, a carpenter and a creature who shouldn't exist found something rare, understanding across an impossible divide. That's worth remembering. That's worth telling, even if no one believes it, even if it's too late. I'm 84 years old. My hands shake when I hold a coffee cup, but this memory will never tremble. And before I'm gone, I needed you to know why Bigfoot felt like family, because he was.